All righty, it looks like it is actually a couple of minutes after that time. So we will go ahead and get ready to get started. I don't know if anybody else is like me, but I am summered out at this point. I am ready for some fall weather. I am ready for that kind of a year. And I saw something this morning that said in about 10 days we'll have a day where the high is 78. My air conditioner would say thank you very much at that point. So, as we get started this morning, prayer list. I do know that Mr. Logan is set to have back surgery this week. That's Friday, right? Yep. So Gary is having his surgery on Friday. Let's see, according to the bulletin, Betty Hayes has got surgery set for September the 9th. Ravenel Morris, Elaine Perry at home. Anything on Lena? Any update on Lena? I know she's been waiting on some results. School's going back tomorrow in Christian County. I think just about everywhere else is going back. I think UHA goes back. Tammy, what day y'all go back? Wednesday. Trig went back last week. I think we about got everybody back in school. There are a lot of college folks who are either transported or are transporting at this point in time. I know I've seen some pictures of those who have moved in. I think I saw a picture of Sadie the other day getting moved in, and Allison getting moved in, and so lots of moving in for some, a lot of them for the first time this time. Okay, Debbie Smith, Donette. Okay. Debbie Smith's sister, Don Atwood. My dad had a round with a kidney stone this past week or so. It's at 90 and a half. That was a bit of an issue for him. So, anybody else? Any updates? Anything? If not, Brother Pete, would you start us with a prayer and we'll get going this morning? All right, thanks, sir. All right, we're continuing on, rolling through Galatians, one true gospel. We are about getting close to the end of the book. Last week we were at the end of chapter 5. We got a couple of things we didn't quite get to, so if you want to get to where we're going to start out, we're going to start beginning verse 22 of chapter 5. Verse 22, and we'll look real quickly through verse 26. We had been talking some last week about the works of the flesh versus the fruits of the Spirit, as we had talking about. Paul had been trying to make the difference of walking by in the flesh as opposed to walking in the Spirit. And he had talked about the things that if you were walking in the flesh, the evidence of that, what he called the works of the flesh, were these things that you could see. And then he also talked about the fruits. We looked then at the fruits of the Spirit, the things that if we are walking by Spirit should just naturally emanate from us and should become a part of our life if we're walking in the Spirit. Now, if you look now at verse 22, it says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The law is not against such things. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another or envying one another." Now, note again there, as he gets to the end of the list of things that he talks about as being fruits of the Spirit, he says, again, the law is not against such things. Now, when we started this, we talked about he is dealing with people who are trying to drift back into aspects of Judaism, thereby negating or taking away from what Jesus had done. And what he tries, when he talks about here, the works, the fruits of the flesh, fruits of the Spirit, he's talking about, hey, the law doesn't stand against these things. When you exhibit these fruits of the Spirit, there is no law against any of this. Nothing. There's nothing wrong with any of them. We looked at some of those last week, and we got about part of the way through the list, and one of the ones we didn't get to is faithfulness. Faithfulness. If you're walking in the Spirit, then one of the fruits of that is going to be faithfulness. The more we press into God, the more we learn about Him, and the more we have a relationship with Him, the more we will desire to be faithful to Him. Any of you, you can shake your head up and down, left and right or whatever. Any of you been at that point where you found that it's easier to stay faithful the more you're staying in touch? The more you spend time in study, the more you spend time in prayer, the more you press into God, as that first sentence says, it's easier to stay faithful. How many of you have also found the times where maybe you don't read as much Bible, you don't pray as much, that it's a little easier to slip away at times when you're not staying what we would term plugged in? We like to think that in this world today we are connected to everything because we're plugged in. Technology has us where we can connect with anyone, anytime, instantly, or we can connect with people, we can connect with information, we can just be connected and plugged in, and we just feel like we're connected. But are we plugged in terms of our faith? And when you find those times that maybe you feel God is distant, or you feel that God has sort of stepped away from you, maybe we need to all, me included, stepping on my own toes here, maybe we need to look in the mirror and say, have I been the one that's disconnected? Because I guarantee you this, it hadn't been God that's disconnected, it has been us. Whether it's we're spending less time in prayer, whether we're spending less time in His Word, or less time in meditation, it usually ends up being us who is disconnected, and we become more susceptible to temptations, more susceptible to falling away in those times where we're not pressing into God. When we're pressing into God, studying His Word, spending time in prayer, it becomes easier to stay faithful. And if we're walking in the Spirit, that faithfulness then becomes exhibited. Let me ask you a question. Can people look at you and tell whether or not you're being faithful in your life? Can people tell? And my answer to you is probably going to be, you're going to think, well, no, they probably can't tell. People can tell. And I think that's why it's important that Paul lists this here as a fruit of the Spirit. People can tell by looking at your life. We talked about at the end of class last week, if you're exhibiting these things, you have a great witness. You don't have to be physically testifying to someone. If you're walking in the Spirit and you're walking in touch with God, if you're walking pressing into God, people can tell. You're a witness just by how you live your life. Now, if you're not plugged into your faith and you're slipping back, believe it or not, people can tell. Because you will exhibit it somehow, some way, in some fashion. And sometimes the most powerful testimony we have is not what we verbally say, but it's how we live. A lot of people can talk the talk, but sometimes people don't walk the walk. We need to walk the walk and people will see it. What about gentleness and self-control as a fruit of the Spirit? Gentleness and self-control. Let's go on the first half of this one first. What about gentleness as a fruit of the Spirit? Now, this is not addressing the world here. This is addressing Christians as these fruits of the Spirit. Look around us today. Is there gentleness lacking in Christianity? Be honest now. Is there gentleness lacking in Christianity? Pete hits it. In a lot of cases. How does the world right now, a great majority of the world, see Christians and their behavior? No different than anybody else. And probably, Tammy, in many aspects, less gentle than other people. Well, because the expectations are higher. But here's the problem. Here's the problem in the church. We have allowed Christianity to become identified with those people who the media and others point to on TV who are screaming and yelling and ranting and raving and being anything but Christ-like by what they put on social media or anywhere. And it's not very gentle. I think in a previous class I talked about here, you could find it on YouTube. There was a video of this preacher at one of the big churches in Louisville who literally on a Sunday morning sermon was screaming that if you weren't going to vote like he did, he was calling down curses on people. Calling down curses on people. That's how people perceive a great many of Christians today. And folks, it ain't very gentle. And here's one of the great biblical examples of this. What did Jesus tell his disciples who wanted to call down fire on people? No. Plus, secondly is, how many people are you going to want to inquire about Jesus when you're yelling and screaming at them? Folks, unless you can go to the Bible and find book and verse that it's either right or wrong, be very careful when you're screaming at somebody that they're wrong and you're right. And be very careful in the attitude how you are to approach it anyway. Where in the Bible does it tell us, go to someone and scream that they're living wrong? We are to spread the news, the good news, how? With a demeanor of love. Nowhere. In fact, when you look at Jesus getting angry, who was he most angry with most of the time? It was not those who were living wrong in the world. He got angry at who? He got angry at the religious leaders. Those who were supposed to know better. Those who were supposed to know what they were doing. And he got angry in many instances with them because they were not expressing love. You know, he tells them, you know the words, you know all of this, but you don't love. This world right now is a place where gentleness is sadly lacking, period. But I'm afraid to say that we have gotten to the point in many churches, in many aspects of Christianity, where there is no gentleness. We've gotten into it in our culture, obviously. In our politics, there is no get along anymore. It's scream and yell and everybody's wrong on the other side. That's seeping into the church. That's seeping into Christian faith, where you want to yell and scream at people. Gentleness is sometimes translated meekness and speaks to a person who possesses control over actions and emotions. Here's the thing, gentleness and meekness, it doesn't mean weakness to be gentle. How many of you would say Jesus was a great example of how to be gentle with people? Now, how many of you would look the Lord in the face and say, Lord, but you were weak? Don't think so. A great example of dealing someone with an attitude of gentleness, the encounter with the woman at the well. Jesus didn't approve how she was living her life, did he? But he didn't yell and scream at her that you're awful. He exhibited compassion, he exhibited gentleness to her, and ultimately he reached her. Meekness, gentleness is not weakness. I Googled, just for fun, Googled gentleness in today's Christianity and came back with some interesting text. Came back with a perceived lack of gentleness in today's Christianity is a growing concern. Well, I would say that's probably pretty right. With some arguing that it has become a common roadblock in the Christian witness. How many of you would agree that if you have no gentleness, if you're yelling and screaming at people, it can be a roadblock to your witness? You can hinder not just your witness, you can hinder the witness of others. You can hinder the cause of Christ when you fail to exhibit gentleness. Because as sad as it is to say that people will look at just one person and say, that's the way all Christians are, that's the way people do. People will look at one person who professes to be Christian, who exhibits no meekness, who exhibits none of the characteristics. They'll look at that person and say, every one of them's like that. They're just like everybody else. That's what they'll say. So it becomes a roadblock. While gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit, it is often misunderstood as weakness, and many Christians today prioritize other qualities like strength and assertiveness, even in situations where gentleness would be more effective. There are a lot of Christians who think you got to get up in somebody's face and yell and raise your tone to be an effective Christian. And it's not the case. This lack of gentleness can manifest in public interactions, political discourse, and within the church itself, potentially hindering the spread of the gospel. That was the most powerful sentence that found on this when it did this scan. The lack of gentleness can manifest in public interactions, political discourse, and within the church itself. Are we having this problem in our world today? We can all look at the political aspect and say, there's a problem, we have that problem. Now, let's bring it a little closer to home. Are we occasionally, or is there a problem even inside churches where we're not being gentle with one another? And here's the thing. If we do not exhibit gentleness with one another, people from outside, those in the world will look in and say, look, if you guys can't be gentle and kind with one another, how are you going to treat me? Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit, and if we're truly walking in the Spirit, we are going to exhibit gentleness. Biblical gentleness is not about passive, now let's understand this, it's not about being passive or timid, but rather about using our strength with restraint, compassion, and wisdom. It's about having strength under control, not a lack of strength. It's not to let yourself be mealy-mouthed and let people walk over you and wash over you, but it's to exhibit a strength that comes from God in a way that's appropriate, in a way that has people wanting to know, okay, so how do I find this? Because ultimately, that's what, if we're walking in the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit that we exhibit should make others want to look at you and go, hey, tell me more about how you do, why you're doing what you do, how you do it, how you get through tough times. Tell me more about Jesus. Tell me more about God. Self-control. And gentleness and self-control can really hinge close together here. Because sometimes it takes self-control to exhibit gentleness. But self-control can apply to a lot of aspects of your life. Not just only your temper and demeanor, but things, maybe weakness areas in your life. Trying to exhibit self-control over things that try to hook you, maybe had their hooks on you prior. Things of the flesh, spirit things, or whatever. Self-control speaks to having control over fleshly desires, period. Showing purity in mind and conduct. Ever battled with self-control? And it doesn't mean to, necessarily just fleshly things as we think of lust and sexual matters. Desires of the flesh can be other things too, but if you ever struggle with self-control in a matter, maybe it's reining in your temper with someone that irritates you. For those who have ever had siblings in their life, sometimes it takes self-control, doesn't it? Not to punch them out when you're growing up. But self-control is when we were able to rein in and sort of keep ourselves under control. And when we're walking in the Spirit, when we're living in the Spirit, we exhibit that. And again, that becomes another one of those things that people around you can see. Reining in and having self-control, gentleness and self-control, very close tied together. And then we look, verse 26 ends with an interesting admonition. He's talked about all of these things, all of these fruits of the Spirit. One writer said that verse 26 ends with an interesting admonition that some think is out of place with this discussion, but Paul is making a beautiful point about the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit that we're bearing in Christ is not a competition or a reason for pride. There is not to be a holier than thou attitude as we walk in the Spirit. In other words, I'm not to go up to Pete and say, hey, I was more gentle than you were this week. I'm better than you. Or Brad's not to go to Troy and say, hey, I did better here in this aspect than you did this week. It's not a competition. And he's trying to point out, these are great fruits. This is what you should exhibit in your life, but don't take pride in them. Because if you're walking in the Spirit and you're exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit, here's what we need to remember. It's not coming from us, it's coming from where? It's coming from God. That's what we talked about last week, that Paul compared the works of the flesh versus the fruits of the Spirit. The fruits of the Spirit come by walking in the Spirit, but they come from above. So there's no reason for us to take pride in the fact that we have self-control, or that we are gentle, or that we're more gentle, Troy, that I'm more gentle than you, I'm better. That's not, he wants to warn here that that's not how you're to be. Exhibit these fruits. Walk in the Spirit with a proper attitude. So many things, would you agree that so many things in our Christian life have to deal with having the proper attitude? Christians can take more things that are good and bend them out of place than anybody else. We are not to have a holier than you attitude as we walk in the Spirit and exhibit the fruits of the Spirit. All right, now we're going to move on into chapter 6, the last chapter of the letter. And if you'll go ahead and turn to verse 1, chapter 6, verse 1, and we'll go through verse 5. Brothers and sisters, if someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also won't be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone considers himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Let each person examine his own work, and then he can take pride in himself alone and not compare himself with someone else. For each person will have to carry his own load. 5 short verses here, but some really to the point stuff we're going to see. And again, right there in the first verse of chapter 6, there's a word that we just were talking about comes up again. What's the word? Gentle. Gentleness comes up right away. Talking about bearing one another's burdens. He talks about bearing one another's burdens. We are to be helping each other grow fruit. Coming off just talking about the fruits of the Spirit, we are to be helping each other grow fruit. And now we see Paul in Galatians 6 striving to show us what love for one another looks like. Talking and bearing each other's burdens. Do something is one of the things he points out here, to do something. Paul starts out talking about helping one another in cases of any sin, not just what we might deem a serious sin. He says, do something. So what are we to do? If we see a brother sin and they're dealing with this issue, what do? He talks about restoring. He talks about restoring. And again, he talks about restoring in that attitude of gentleness. Gentleness. Remember that Paul says that we must not stand by and do nothing. That we are to reach out and to help and to restore them. A lot of people just want to say, oh, I'll just walk away. I won't go look. I'm not going to see him. He knows better. He says we are to help. We are to restore, help to restore. But there are things we are not to do in an effort to restore someone. We are not to despise the person or condemn them in our hearts. This one gets to be a problem area sometimes, does it not? Sometimes there are people who profess to be Christian that look at someone who stumbled and say, oh, I knew they were bad. I knew they weren't really doing what they were supposed to. Or they look at somebody and say, oh, I can't believe they did that. That's awful. That's human nature to do that part, isn't it? It's human nature for us to look at someone who's caught in a sin and just gossip, condemn, belittle. But we're not. We're supposed to work to restore them in an attitude of gentleness. We're not to gossip to others about the person. Ever seen that happen? And I hate to say, ever seen that happen in a church? Or someone, a member of that body, or someone who's connected to a family member in that body, they get caught in a sin and they get tied up in some things they probably shouldn't have got tied up in. And the grapevine is running heavy. Ever seen that? That's not how we're supposed to be. But we've all seen it, where somebody says, oh, you won't believe where I saw this person at. Or you won't believe what they did. I got to call Sue and say, hey, do you know? Now we don't even have to wait to make a phone call. I look at text and send a picture. We're not to gossip about others because you know why? Warning, it could just as easily happen to one of us. I've heard a lot of people say, they look at somebody caught up in a sin and say, that could never happen to me. Won't bet. Won't bet. When you have that attitude of that could never happen to me, watch out. I've heard lots of people say that, and then suddenly, maybe it's not them, but their family or somebody else is affected by that. It can happen to anybody. It's like, I had a cousin. I would have, if at one point I would have had the attitude, nobody in my family could ever mess with drugs or get hooked on that. I had a cousin who got caught up in meth. He got caught up working for some really bad people. And then I told you all the story about him last summer. Those people threatened him, his girlfriend, and her daughter. And my cousin got to the point he saw no way out that he shot himself. It can happen to anybody. We should never be willing to just gossip about somebody who's in trouble. It can happen to any of us at any time. This Greek word that is translated into English as restore was a word used in secular Greek for setting a fractured bone and means to knit together. When someone that we know, when someone, a brother or sister, we see that they get caught in a sin and they need to be restored, they need to be brought back, we are to help to work to knit the bones. We're to restore, help them get back together and become strong again. But too often, you know what we want to do? We want to grab that broken bone and twist and make it worse. But the word restore here in the Greek means to help it knit back together. That's the attitude that we are to have in helping others when they've stumbled. So, how are we to do this? Even if many of us would say, okay, I understand that, I see what your point is there, but how am I to do this? How can I help someone get restored? I have enough trouble keeping myself in line. How do we get restored? The spiritual are supposed to go to that one in a spirit of, here we go again, what? Gentleness. That means either friends in the church, elders in the church, are to go to that person not in a spirit of condemnation, not in a spirit of critical, but in a spirit of gentleness and say, hey, we need to talk about what's going on. Gentleness. Not that. Too many times when we go to someone to point out their wrongs, we look like this guy. That's not what they need. How many of you have ever, and you don't have to raise a hand or anything like this, but how many of you have ever found yourself in a situation where that attitude might have sent you running the other way? What you want is somebody to understand, somebody to listen, somebody to be compassionate, and when you say, you're sorry, I wish I hadn't done it, they would understand. How many of you, this guy here, would send you packing up and going the other way? Because oftentimes, people who know that they've done something wrong, who've been caught up in something wrong, are already beating themselves up like this. People who actually care and understand that they've done something wrong, many times are already doing this to themselves. They don't need anybody else to jump in on the party. Gentleness is one of the characteristics we read that reveal the fruit of the Spirit, and that's how we're to deal with people who are dealing with problems. We're coming to them with our emotions and words under control. How many of you at work or when dealing with something have what is known as the 24-hour rule? Anybody ever heard that? I had a basketball coach that I worked with when I was at Caldwell County. He and I actually both grew up in bordering competing schools in central Kentucky. But he told me one time if he had a parent who was upset with the amount of playing time that their child was getting, or something that had happened in a game, they were upset, they wanted to talk to the coach, they'd come to him after the game, he says, I'll not talk to you tonight. We'll talk to you tomorrow. So that everything would be under control and not in the heat of the moment. I've worked for employers who said when they got upset with something another staff member had done, would not address it with that staff member for 24 hours. Why? Because oftentimes emotions were raw, things are tender, everybody's attitudes are up in the air, and doing it before the 24 hours would pass would not be good for anybody. That's because you've had a chance over the 24 hours to get your emotions and words under control. As we are dealing with those who have fallen, those who have stumbled, when we go to them to talk to them, we should go to them with our emotions and words under control. We also need to go with them with the understanding we're dealing potentially with somebody's eternal soul, and one wrong word, one wrong phrase, one wrong attitude could affect them forever. And I think a lot of us need to remember that when we're dealing with someone, is that we need to be careful with what we say and what we do, because what happens could affect them eternally. And if we keep that in our mind, we'll be a lot more careful with how we approach people. A writer said a lack of gentleness is a sign of immaturity, and is why the spiritual are commanded to go restore a fallen believer. Do you send somebody who's been a Christian for just 2 weeks to address someone who's fallen? Pete, as an elder, would you say that's a wise thing to do? You don't send a new convert to someone who's dealing with sin issues. It takes spiritual maturity. And again, with spiritual maturity, you're more likely to at least have that inkling for gentleness and self-control. Now, back to the question we've also talked about a little bit earlier, is gentleness missing in our Christian faith today? And I would say not in all cases, but I would say in any cases too many, but in far too many cases, it is missing. It's missing. There have been several articles written by Christian writers today noting that gentleness is a Christian fruit that is greatly lacking among believers. You know, we're walking in truth, we're being faithful, we're doing all the things, we're studying, we're praying, but when it comes to our dealing with others, a lot of times we ain't being real gentle. Gentleness is a caring, calm humility that allows one to see others as God sees them. And maybe we should add to that, when we're dealing with others, the gentleness needs to be, we need to exhibit the gentleness towards them that we want God to exhibit toward us. We want others to be gentle with us. We want God to be gentle with us. Then what right do we have not to be gentle with someone else? Philippians 4:5, let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. It doesn't say be loud, be boisterous, condemn others, criticize others. It says in Philippians, let your gentleness be evident. That doesn't mean just be gentle. It means let it be seen that you are gentle. Colossians 3:12 said, since God chose you to be the holy people He loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Now look at this verse again a little closer. Written to the church of Colossae. It doesn't suggest, it doesn't say you should try to be gentle. It says what? What's that word? You must. It doesn't say every other day you should be gentle. It says you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness. It's not a suggestion. We have to cover ourselves with gentleness. So, what are some examples today where gentleness is lacking in Christianity? I don't think you could say it's just here, there, just all different aspects. Not just, it'd be easy to point the finger at politics, but there are a lot of things where we're just not acting real gentle. And we need to keep that gentle attitude. We need to remember how Jesus dealt with others. Those he encountered who were in sin, Jesus was very gentle with. He didn't endorse. Now, understand this, gentleness does not mean endorsement of a behavior or endorsement of a sin, but it's in how you deal with that person. Like the woman at the well, he didn't endorse her behavior, but he said he gently dealt with her. Some Christians engage in heated and often ungracious online interactions. Ever see that while you're on Facebook or Twitter? Or X, rather. You can go through Facebook and it doesn't take you 10 minutes to find somebody who is ranting and raving, and that somebody professes to be Christian. There are a lot of Christians out there revving it up on Facebook. And here's the kicker. People see that and know who you are. And especially when we're discussing theological or political differences. Jonathan Edwards, legendary theologian, kin to Aaron Burr. In his religious affections, Jonathan Edwards insists an essential trait of any true Christian is the lamb-like, dove-like spirit and temper of Jesus Christ. He presents this point as nothing less than a fundamental of the faith. He insists the evidence in Scripture is, quote, so very abundant as to prove such traits are essential marks of true Christians. So there's a warning. We've got 3 minutes. There's a warning that is issued here. When talking about restoring, Paul does issue a warning. Paul issues the warning of, as you're doing this, keep watch on yourself. Why is that? I think there's a couple of angles here. One is so you don't allow yourself to get pulled into whatever they're caught up in. I think there's also an angle here that don't let yourself get caught up in pride. If you help bring them back, don't think that's something you did. But there's a warning, don't get caught up in what they're in, but don't think you're all that. Commentator I came across here said, there is a temptation to sin in this process. Spiritual pride is a great temptation in trying to restore another. We must be mindful that anyone can fall and no one is above temptation. Even in trying to do the right thing, Satan will tempt us to sin in this process. Do you ever think about that? Even when you're trying to do something right, the devil's sitting there trying to get you to do something wrong. He's working at every opportunity that he can to get you messed up. And if he can use your own pride to get you to sin, he'll do it. If he can use the enticement of something when you're trying to restore someone else, he'll do it. But he will use whatever he can to tempt you in that process. And we will stop there and pick up with talking about burden bearing next week because we are at time. And we will continue on right there.